right. So I'm going to start off with a question. I have a picture up here of a segregated classroom in Kansas, and I'm going to ask you to guess what year it was taken, what decade, what year. And just to give you a frame of reference, Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled that segregation was unconstitutional in schools, was passed in 1954. So someone toss out a year, toss out a decade.
The 50s.
50s, all right. Same thing here. What about this? I think I hear 80s. 90s. And 60s. All right, and then last one, I promise. Does anyone know what year this was? This was the attempted integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. This was 1957, so this was 3 years after Brown versus Board of Education. So we tend to get a really linear cause-effect, problem-solution view of desegregation in schools. First, we had segregation, then we integrated, and maybe it was painful, but we did it, and now our schools are integrated. But two of these images are from the present day. This one up here is a 2015 school in Chicago. The one on the other side is a school in Memphis, dated 2004. Every single student at that elementary school is African American. And the pictures don't look so different from 1953, the year before Brown versus Board was passed. So the important thing to keep in mind is that segregation did decrease after Brown versus Board was passed, but it has reemerged in the American public education system. In 1972, only 25% of African American students in the South still attended minority schools. By 2011, over 50% of African American students were once again attending minority schools. Put simply, Southern states are more segregated today than they were 40 years ago. And that's not me exaggerating, that's not me being dramatic, that is a direct quotation from the US Department of Justice. But the fact that the numbers haven't just stayed the same, that they did improve before they got worse again, shows that there is something we can do to combat this issue, and we're just not doing it. In 1971, the United States Supreme Court upheld desegregation busing, which was intended to bus students to schools for which they were not zoned, to racially mix those schools and combat the segregation that arose from segregated housing. And as indicated by the numbers I gave you previously, this was effective. But as soon as busing was discontinued, segregation reemerged, and we ended up where we are today. So why is this something we're even talking about in 2018? It seems like this should have been over 60 years ago. Well, inequality in American education is not hurting just our individual students, but our performance as a whole. We've all heard the statistics about how we're at the very bottom of the pile internationally, and it's true. The United States ranks 29th and 35th out of 40 countries internationally on PISA tests, right behind Latvia and Azerbaijan. So we need to change something. And what we need to change is that achievement gap. If you look deeper into that OECD data that I just cited, you can see that white and Asian students actually score above the international average. It's Black and Hispanic students that score below the international average. Now I need to be very, very careful to assure you that this is not individual deficiency in those students. This is systemic inequality in our public education system and society. Linda Darling-Hammond of Stanford University actually states that 40%, so nearly half, of individual variance in achievement comes from just two factors, neither of which is internal. Those factors are teacher quality and spending. And these are two factors that vary drastically based on the school you go to and the makeup of that school. Low-income school buildings, which correlate with high numbers of minority students, lack equity in building maintenance, access to technology, rigor of curriculum, and the ever-important teacher quality. So as Brown versus Board put it, segregation is inherently unequal. So why busing? Why is that the solution? Well, we have to understand why modern-day segregation arises, and it's primarily due to housing segregation. According to a 2013 study by Sharkey and colleagues, African American youth are 10 times more likely to live in a poor neighborhood than white youth. Obviously, you see how that would affect the school makeup in those neighborhoods. In Nashville especially, the problem is very severe. Areas such as the Casey Place projects, which is one of the lowest incomes area in Nashville, are actually intentionally isolated, as author Benjamin Houston puts it, by interstate systems that cut them off from the rest of the city. So if all of the students in neighborhood A are going to school A and all the students in neighborhood B, it might be a wealthy gated community, are going to school B, you can see what effects that would have. And that's exactly how it plays out. According to Ansley Erickson, who's written the seminal work about segregation in Nashville, 72% of Latino students and 64% of African American students in Nashville today attend high poverty schools. Only 34% of white students in Nashville attend high poverty schools. And this matters. Nationwide, the average low-income student attends a school that scores in the 42nd percentile on national exams. The average high-income student, a school that scores in the 61st percentile. So that's a 20 percentile point difference just based on the school you're going to. And that's according to Rothwell. So what does busing do? Well, in Nashville, busing did historically solve the problem. In 1971, desegregation busing was implemented in Nashville, and it quickly became what Erickson calls one of the most integrated cities in the nation. It actually was so successful that in 1998, Nashville was declared unitary, meaning that it was no longer segregated enough to require desegregation. So busing ceased, segregation came back, and we ended up where we are today. Remember the statistics that I cited earlier from ProPublica. In 1972, 1 year after busing was implemented in Nashville, only a quarter of black students still attended minority schools. By 2011, after busing had ceased, those numbers were over 50%. This is catastrophic. As I hinted at earlier, integration does more than just integrate schools. It actually boosts student achievement. At the height of integration, black test scores improved, according to Erickson, and white students' test scores did not decrease. They remained stable, or in some cases also increased. And countrywide, and this is today, the National Assessment of Education Progress reports that low-income fourth graders who attend high-income schools are 2 years ahead of their equal-income peers who attend low-income schools. So same income for the students, different income for the schools, and that's a 2-year difference on average. Students enrolled in integrated schools also tend to drop out less, and they have higher college enrollment rates, and there are a host of other more specific statistics that you can find about the benefits of integration for all parties. So why, if the benefits are so obvious, is busing an issue? Well, it's a little bit more complicated legally than it was back in the 70s. In 2006 and 2007, 2 Supreme Court cases ruled that assigning students to school based on race was unconstitutional. We are, however, allowed to assign them based on socioeconomic class, which has been found to have the same effects. This has been done in various counties across the country, including Wake County, North Carolina. They implemented socioeconomic busing so that no one school had a farm rate, a free reduced meal rate, of more than 40%. And in 2005, the North Carolina State Board of Education reported that 64% of their low-income high schoolers passed end-of-year exams in Wake County, whereas that number was less than 50% in all of the surrounding counties that had not implemented busing. So this is what we need to do in Nashville. If you look at Carter Lawrence straight down the road, that does not have that 40% or less farm rate. At Carter Lawrence, it's 61%. And their state test scores reflect that. They have 81% of students do not score proficient on ELA, and 63% do not score proficient on science exams statewide. And that's according to the Tennessee Department of Education. So why haven't we brought it back to Nashville? Obviously, whenever we're considering new policy, expense is an issue, but Mark Basil actually suggests that the economic benefits of busing, coming from graduation rates and from other successes, would outweigh the costs, and that busing is actually more effective economically than voucher systems, reducing class sizes, or other alternatives that people consider. So most of the opposition is not from lawmakers, it's not from policymakers, it's not from experts in the field, it's from white families. White affluent families who fear that this is going to be essentially sacrificing their children for the sake of the minorities. That's not the case. As I stated before, white test scores do not drop. Actually, what does happen is all students benefit from increased problem-solving skills, critical thinking skills, cross-racial friendships, and an increased sense of civic engagement. And there have been some studies, according to Siegel-Hawley, that actually do report higher test scores for all students, minority and otherwise. As civil rights activist Julian Bond put it, it's not the bus, it's us. It's racism, plain and simple, and it's time to overcome it. We also have to keep in mind that busing is not necessarily a permanent solution. If we implement it so that the minority groups in the city are able to graduate and succeed at a higher rate, the power dynamics will eventually begin to shift, the Nashville landscape will change, and schools will naturally desegregate and integrate. Unfortunately, we just didn't give that enough time to happen the last time around. So I know you've heard me say this 10,000 times now, but American schools are more segregated today than they were 40 years ago. Let that sink in. Think about the ramifications. Think about how busing succeeded in the past. Think about all of our students that will benefit, and bring busing back to Nashville.